A house can be a cage when the doors are never locked. Mine was made of soft carpet pastel curtains and the lingering smell of oversteeped tea. You wouldn't call it prison at first glance, but prisons aren't built with bars alone. They're built with silence, with withheld smiles, with the careful shifting of your name into a burden. I remember the rain the night my son texted me. It felt like it wanted to erase the world, a frantic scribble of water smearing out every edge of the familiar. "We're cutting ties," it said, plain and flat on the screen. No salutation, no punctuation, just a verdict. Like I was some branch of the family tree that had grown crooked and now needed pruning. I stared at that message for a long time. Not in shock, oddly. Not in panic. More like one stares at the last grain of rice in a bowl, wondering how hunger got so quiet. I typed, "Understood," and hit send. It wasn't drama I wanted. It was the peace of knowing where I stood, even if that place was alone. But I wasn't always alone. After my second stroke, Daniel insisted I move in. "You'll be safer here, Dad," he said, and at the time I believed him. His wife Kara was gentle in the early days. She brought me warm soup, asked me about my crossword puzzles, even laughed at my stale jokes. And the kids, my grandchildren, they were a tonic I didn't know I needed. Their tiny arms wrapped around my knees like forgiveness I hadn't earned. But time is a funny sieve. It doesn't just let water pass. It lets masks slip. The kindness I noticed started arriving with receipts. "Daniel opened a joint account for ease," he said. "That way we can manage your pension and medical stuff more efficiently." I nodded, trustingly. Because isn't that what fathers do? Isn't that what the heart does when it still beats with old loyalty? It wasn't sudden, the shift. These things never are. Like dusk bleeding into night, you only notice the dark when you stumble. "Why are you buying magazines again?" Kara once asked, not unkindly but sharply. "We've already subscribed to things for you." Then it was, "We don't really need you watching the kids alone anymore. They're too much for you. Just rest." Then, "Can you sign this? It's just a bank form." Then, "We had to use your card for the groceries, but don't worry, it all evens out." Eventually, I began to disappear. The armchair I loved was moved to the corner. My old books boxed to make room for the kids' crafts. Even the teapot I'd used for 30 years, a chipped, stained thing I loved, was replaced with one of those soulless metal kettles that scream instead of whistle. But the worst part wasn't what was taken. It was how little I protested, because I was tired. Because part of me believed I should be grateful, that I should sit quietly in exchange for a roof, that aging meant shrinking, folding, tucking myself between their needs and mine. After all, they were doing me a favor. And when did I begin to believe I was a favor? It came to a head the day I overheard them, Kara's voice low and frustrated, Daniel's more hesitant. "He's gonna mess up the finances, Dan. You've got to talk to him. That inheritance won't stretch if he keeps pulling cash for junk." Junk! I'd withdrawn $200 to gift my granddaughter a necklace, real silver shaped like a key. I'd wanted her to have something from me that mattered. A story she could carry even when I couldn't walk beside her. But apparently that gesture had to be accounted for, audited like an indulgence I hadn't earned. I didn't confront them that night. I just sat quietly in the living room, holding that key-shaped pendant. The rain had just started then, soft, almost apologetic. It would grow louder, but I didn't know that yet. What I knew was this: my presence had become an expense, That was the beginning. Sometimes liberation isn't a thunderclap. Sometimes it's just the decision to keep your tea bags, to open your own bank account again, to start writing letters to friends you'd lost touch with. Tiny rebellions, quiet reclaimings. The night Daniel sent the text, I'd already set things in motion. I had spoken with a lawyer the week before, a soft-spoken woman who didn't look at me like I was senile. We opened a private account, moved my pension back under my name, and began revisiting the will. She'd told me, "You're not selfish for wanting your own voice." She didn't know how long I'd been mute. So yes, when my son tried to sever me, I did not beg. I did not explain. I simply replied, "Understood." And 24 hours later he called, voice cracking like the thunder I now heard outside. He said, "Dad, maybe we overreacted." Kara didn't mean to sound harsh. "Can we talk?" I said yes, but not from the same chair. I met Daniel at the park, of all places, the same spot where he used to drag me by the hand as a boy, pulling me toward the duck pond, with that wild, impatient joy only a child can sustain. Now he stood beneath the twisted elm, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his eyes scanning the gravel path like it might offer a script for what to say. He looked smaller, not physically, but diminished. His shoulders hunched inward as though the weight of his choices had finally begun pressing against the skin. I took my time reaching him, using my cane more for symbolism than support. "Thanks for coming," he said, voice low. I nodded. Always time for my son. He flinched slightly, and I admit that satisfied something old in me, not vengeance, just the subtle acknowledgement that he knew what he'd done, knew what it meant to be cut off, not with rage but with clarity. "I'm sorry," he said after a pause. "I know we haven't been fair. I waited. I wanted more. Not just apology, understanding. Ownership. I think we got so caught up in managing things we forgot you're not something to manage." Closer. Kara hadn't come. She'd sent her apologies through Daniel, which hung between us like a crumpled white flag. Maybe she was ashamed, or angry, or perhaps she'd never seen me as more than the declining father-in-law who once burned toast and left water on the bathroom floor. That was fine. I wasn't asking to be loved, only to be respected. "I appreciate you saying that," I said slowly. "But what I really need is space, independence. I've already begun the process." He looked up sharply. "You mean moving out?" I smiled gently. "I mean reclaiming what was mine to begin with. My accounts, my choices, my time. I'll still see the grandchildren, if that's permitted." His eyes widened. "Permitted, Dad, of course, but only if I'm treated like someone whose presence is a gift, not a chore." Silence ballooned around us. A jogger passed, his feet thumping against wet leaves. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice, then quieted. Daniel looked at me with something that bordered on recognition, the way a child might look at an old photograph of their parent and realize for the first time that they had a life before them. "I think I forgot who you were," he said. I touched his arm. I did too for a while. We sat on the bench then, not as caretaker and dependent, not even as father and son, but as two men reconciling. Not every rift must be mended with glue. Some are better left as visible seams, reminders of what was broken and then handled with care. The next few weeks passed like wind in tall grass. You notice the movement only when you pause to listen. I found a modest flat on the edge of town. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a balcony that caught the morning light just right. The landlord's daughter reminded me of my late wife, bright-eyed with a mouth too quick to hide kindness. "I can help set up the internet," she offered. "No need," I chuckled. "I've got a nephew who's better at tech than you'd believe." She grinned and said, "Old people always say that, like they're not the ones who invented half of it." I liked her instantly. Rebuilding wasn't easy. There were mornings when my hands trembled too much to button my shirt, and evenings when loneliness pressed against the windows like fog. But there was dignity in the solitude. There was peace in choosing what to eat, what music to play, when to sleep. I hung my old photos on the wall, ones Daniel had packed away in favor of minimalist decor. I made tea in my chipped teapot and read dog-eared books until my eyes watered. And I wrote letters to my late wife, to friends I hadn't spoken to in decades, even to Kara, not out of obligation but to release the bitterness. I wrote, "We are all doing our best with the tools we have. I just needed sharper tools." Daniel came by twice a week, sometimes with the kids, sometimes alone. We talked more honestly than we had in years. He never asked for money again, and I never offered. That too was healing. On a quiet Sunday, my granddaughter sat on my lap and fingered the silver key around her neck. "What's this open?" she asked. "Me," I said, brushing her hair back. "It opens me." She looked at me with a seriousness only children and the elderly possess. "You're already open." I smiled. Maybe I was. The days began to soften after that. I'd forgotten the texture of slow mornings, the small rituals of living alone, pouring tea just right, watching the steam curl into the air like a lazy ghost, listening to the rustle of newspapers, even when I wasn't reading them. Life didn't need to be grand to be worthy. It just needed to be mine. There's a quiet dignity in being overlooked by the world. People don't expect much from a 73-year-old man in wool cardigans who walks with a cane and hums old Sinatra tunes under his breath. They see a relic. But I've come to find that invisibility used wisely becomes a superpower. No one notices when you take up space again, quietly, confidently, when you stop apologizing for breathing. One morning I walked to the corner bakery, a modest place with warm lights and the scent of cinnamon always lingering near the door. The girl behind the counter had begun to recognize me. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," she chirped. I smiled. "Good morning, Nora. 1 cranberry scone and your strongest coffee, please. My body still insists it's 25. She laughed, handing me my order wrapped in brown paper. "Your body might argue, but your eyes don't lie." I winked. They used to lie plenty. Now they're too tired to bother. It's odd, the joy in these tiny exchanges. I once thought connection only came from family, from blood ties and legacies. But it also comes from strangers who remember your name, from neighbors who water your plants when you're out, from the mailman who pauses to chat about the weather just a little too long. And yet there was still grief. Not the sharp kind. Not the type that breaks you open. No, this was the low humming kind, the grief of realizing you let too much time pass in silence, that you mistook endurance for love. Some nights I lay in bed remembering the early years with Daniel, how he'd sit beside me in the garage, legs swinging from the workbench while I taught him to whittle little boats from pine wood. He was such a curious child, sensitive. I wonder when that gentleness hardened. I wonder if I had a part in it. But guilt is another form of ego. I've learned the idea that everything that goes wrong must somehow be your fault. That's a belief I've had to set down like a heavy suitcase. I visited a financial advisor, a brisk woman in her 50s, who looked at my paperwork with approval. "You've done a good thing, Mr. Ellis. Separating your finances, setting clear boundaries. You'd be surprised how many elderly clients don't and pay dearly for it." I told her softly I did pay, just not with money. She didn't ask for more, and I respected her for that. Afterwards, I took a walk through the university gardens. It was spring, and the magnolias had begun their annual flirtation with the sky. There I met an old friend, not someone I'd known for years, but someone from my bridge group, Miriam, who carried herself like a queen who didn't need a crown. We sat on a bench and watched students rush past with lives too big for their backpacks. "Do you miss it?" she asked me suddenly. "What?" "Being useful, being needed." I thought about that. I used to, I admitted. Now I'm learning to enjoy being wanted. There's a difference. She nodded, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Yes, needed is transactional. Wanted is warm. We sat in silence a while until she pulled a small sandwich from her bag and broke it in half, handing me the larger piece. I took it without protest. It felt nice being cared for without strings. That evening, Daniel called. "Dad," he said, voice tentative. "Emily wrote an essay at school about you. Her teacher called me to say it made everyone cry." I chuckled. "That good, huh?" "She wrote that you're the bravest person she knows, that you taught her about keys and choices and how silence can be loud." I had to sit down. "She said you're her hero." For a long time I said nothing. Then finally, "Thank you for telling me." "Would you like to come for dinner?" he asked. "Just you. No expectations. No talk of money. Just a meal." I considered it. "I'd like that." "Good," he said, sounding relieved. "It's time you felt welcome again." "No, son," I replied gently. "It's time I walked in because I wanted to, not because I had nowhere else to go." And so I did. Later that week I visited. I brought wine, wore a shirt with real buttons, walked through the door, not as a ghost, but as a man, as a father, as myself. Dinner was a strange sort of reunion, not the teary-eyed kind you see in movies, but something quieter, more tentative. Like two people relearning a language they used to speak fluently. Kara opened the door, her smile polite but tight like a scarf pulled too close to the throat. "Hi, Mr. Ellis," she said, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, stepping inside. "Evening, Kara." The house hadn't changed much. Same polished floors, same abstract art lining the hallways, sterile pieces that never really spoke to me. But something in the air was different. Less tension, maybe. Or perhaps I was simply no longer tethered to the place the way I once was. Detachment can be its own form of peace. Emily ran to me the moment she spotted me. "Grandpa," she shouted, flinging herself into my arms. That warmth, it nearly undid me. She smelled of strawberries and pencil shavings. Her necklace, the silver key, dangled between us, catching the light. "I missed you," she said into my shoulder. "I missed me too," I whispered, only half joking. Daniel emerged from the kitchen apron dusted with flour. He'd made lasagna, the real kind, not frozen. He looked awkward, nervous, like a boy on his first date with a girl who could see through him. "Glad you came, Dad." "Glad to be invited," I said. The meal was pleasant, if a little stilted at first. Kara complimented my sweater. I told her the truth that I'd bought it myself with my own card. She flinched, then nodded a silent acknowledgement of the weight behind the words. It's remarkable how much power resides in subtlety. You don't need to shout to be heard. Halfway through dinner, Daniel cleared his throat. I wanted to say something. He began, setting down his fork. Not just sorry. I've said that already. But thank you for stepping back, for showing me what stepping up really looks like. I met his eyes. You're learning, I said. That's enough. Kara looked at me, then really looked. Her eyes were misty, and for the first time I saw something behind the polished exterior. Fear, perhaps, or regret. Or maybe just the dawning realization that love, when laced with control, is no love at all. I never meant to hurt you, she said quietly. I know, I replied. But meaning well and doing well aren't the same. She nodded slowly. Do you think we can try again? I think we can begin, I said. After dinner, Emily showed me a journal she'd started. She called it The Book of Brave. On the first page, she'd drawn a picture of me, gray hair, walking stick, and a big red heart on my chest. I told my teacher, "You're the bravest person I know because you left when things felt bad, even though people told you to stay," she said. And because you said, "understood," instead of yelling. That's big brave, not loud brave. I blinked back tears. Out of the mouths of children, as they say. Before I left, Daniel walked me to the porch. I don't want things to go back to the way they were, he said. They won't, I answered. That's the point. He nodded. But I do want you in our lives. I'll be here, I said, but on my own terms. When I returned home, the flat felt different. Lighter. Not because I'd mended things, but because I hadn't needed to destroy myself to do it. In the following weeks, life unfolded slowly. I joined a writing group, started volunteering at the library, helping kids pick out books and teaching the occasional chess game. I bought a new coat. Not because I needed one, but because it made me feel handsome. I even went on a date. Miriam from the park. We drank wine at a quiet little bistro where the waiter called us, "You two lovebirds," and we laughed so hard my ribs ached. She told me I had a mischievous smile. I told her she had eyes like falling leaves, rich, brittle, and full of change. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was companionship, and that was enough. And Daniel? He started therapy, on his own. No prodding. He said he wanted to understand how he let money and control become substitutes for care. That's a lifelong journey, I told him. Good, he said. I've got time. And I think he does. Emily calls me every Thursday now. We read poems to each other. She's discovered Sylvia Plath and E. Cummings. She wrote one of her own. My grandpa walks on air that's heavier than most. He carries keys to doors we didn't know were locked. And when he says, "understood," it means more than okay. It means he saw the fire and walked through it anyway. I framed that one. Sometimes healing isn't a revolution. It's a return not to what was, but to who you've always been underneath the noise. And for the first time in many years, I sleep with my bedroom door open, because I'm not afraid anymore. It was sometime in late June when I finally stopped counting the days. Not in the dramatic way you hear from people after breakups or retirements, not with a grand declaration. This is the first day of the rest of my life. No. Mine was quieter. I realized over tea and the slow hum of a jazz record that I hadn't looked at a calendar in over a week. No appointments circled in red. No birthdays looming. Just light slanting in through the kitchen window, illuminating a vase of wildflowers I'd bought for myself. There's a different kind of freedom in that, The freedom of no longer measuring your worth by how many people depend on you or how well you serve a role. Father, grandfather, provider, burden. Those labels had clung to me like wet clothes after a storm. I'd carried them even when no one asked me to. Especially when no one asked me to. Now I moved more slowly, not because of age, but because I was finally savoring things. It was Miriam who noticed first. One evening on her porch, as we shared a modest peach cobbler, she said, "You're softer lately. Not weaker, softer. Like you're not bracing for impact anymore." I smiled. Maybe I finally realized the sky isn't falling. You ever think it was never falling? That maybe you just stood under the wrong roof for too long? I laughed. Now that's a line I should write down. And I did. Later in my journal, beneath a list titled, "Things No One Teaches You About Growing Older," you can forgive people and still not let them back in. Silence is not the same as peace. It is okay to buy yourself flowers. Family should be a choice, not a sentence. The hardest part isn't reclaiming your life. It's believing you deserve to. That last one took me years to understand. Maybe a whole life, really. I was born into a time when men were told to sacrifice, to provide, to never speak of fear or fragility. So when my health failed and my body slowed, and the usefulness everyone had once praised began to slip from my fingers, I thought I was failing them. I never considered they might be failing me. But now I see it. I see how easily love curdles when mixed with obligation, how quickly concern becomes control. I see the ways people use language like "for your own good" to smother someone else's agency. And I see how, if you're not careful, the love you give becomes a leash, something that tightens every time you try to move in a direction they didn't choose for you. I don't blame Daniel entirely. He is a man shaped by his own shadows, a husband trying to please his wife, a father anxious to secure his children's future. But I cannot carry the cost of his fear anymore. I won't. We still meet for breakfast once a week. A small diner near the river. Sticky menus. Strong coffee, the kind of place with regulars who nod at you like a secret society. We talk about books, about politics, about Emily's newfound obsession with painting. We don't talk much about the months I lived in his house. Not out of avoidance, but because we both know some scars are best left unpicked. Instead, we build forward. Week by week, bite by bite. One day he asked, "Do you ever think about moving back in? Just in case. I mean, if things got worse again." I looked at him long and level. "If my health turns," I said, "I'll make arrangements. But I won't go back to being invisible." He nodded, eyes shining with something between apology and admiration. "Fair enough." And Kara. She sends occasional messages now. Small things: a photo of Emily in her school, play a link to a poem she thinks I'd like. She's trying in her way. I can respect that. I reply when I feel moved to. I don't feel the need to perform forgiveness. Sometimes grace is silent. I keep my world small now, purposefully. Not in fear, but in reverence. I plant herbs on my windowsill. I write letters to people I once believed were lost to time. I listen, truly listen, when someone speaks without waiting for my turn to talk. And every so often I go back and read that text. The one Daniel sent. "We're cutting ties." Funny thing, though. I used to think that meant an end, that something vital had been severed. But some ties are ropes, and some ropes are nooses. Cutting them, That was the first time I breathed in years. So when I replied, understood what I meant was I see you now. I see what this has become. And I see the door behind me open just enough for light to pour through. I simply chose to walk through it.